Welcome back to Black History Year, where we celebrate Black culture and question everything they taught us in school. If you're ready for the real history, hit like and subscribe. Let's get it.
Before we dive deep into today's conversation around Black familial legacies, we like to open up all our conversations with the same questions for all of our guests. What does Black liberation mean to you, Martha?
I'm a historian by training, so I can't help but think about liberation, freedom as, on the one hand, our ability, our possibility of telling our own stories, and at the same time, no longer being bound by stories of the past. I don't want to throw over history. I don't want to give it up. I think it's important to who we are and how we know ourselves. But I don't want us to feel bound or obliged to it either.
Very curious, how might you define family legacy? And what do you think family legacy has to do with Black liberation? What might they say to one another?
I love that question. When you first mentioned legacy, my mind goes to material things, right? Is there a homestead? Is there a cup and saucer or a little trinket of jewelry? I think there is that material legacy, but maybe those material things are really just doorways into legacies that are really about our spirits and our souls and our sense of self. And I think that as I think about legacy and family, what has surprised me as I've learned more about my own family is how much of them lives in me, and I didn't know it. I didn't know it, or I didn't attribute some of my own qualities and some of my own dilemmas to ancestors. I thought they were mine. And I think today I better understand how I am living a kind of legacy that is about material things. I know we're going to talk about skin and other things, but really is about ways of seeing the world, ways of being in the world. So for me, that's a powerful kind of legacy.
Absolutely. That's so rich, this cultural and spiritual repository that we inherit from our ancestors that allow us to better understand ourselves, better understand the world that we navigate. I am curious, though, when we think about the ways that institutions can govern how families are defined, how they're constructed, why do you think genealogical storytelling, the kind that you leverage in your memoir, tracing one's roots, why do you think that sort of storytelling matters today?
I'm so steeped in that world. It's almost hard to step back, but I think it's important to. In some ways, those of us who subscribe to this kind of storytelling, this way of remembering, this way of constructing our families and ourselves, I think we are the inheritors of a moment in the 1970s that I'll call Roots, because that's what it was called. The text, the mini-series, that was a moment in which we were strongly introduced to the possibility that we could remember and that we could recall. And so I think in some ways, perhaps not for everyone who comes to genealogy, but for many people, it is almost in defiance of the notion that we don't have a history or that we can't know our history. Our history has been taken from us or deprived. I would put myself among those who say, not quite, right? And watch us, right? Watch us remember, watch us reconstruct, even if our stories are partial, fragmented. Watch us make our own history where folks wanted to tell us there was none. So there is that sort of defiant insistence on making what folks said we couldn't have or we weren't entitled to.
Absolutely. One thing that I heard in your response here, Martha, and one thing that came up while I was engaging your text and in my own background, trying to stage some genealogical research, is really the attention with an archive, official canons, documentations, things of that nature. With that said, I want to lift up a quote and just want you to respond to it. This comes to us from Sadia Hartman. She says, "The past changes according to what questions we ask, The archive is living. The archive is a living, moving thing. The sources we can put our eyes on are changing as we speak.
I am a great admirer and student of this idea, and which is to say that it lands very well, it lands very squarely on how I think about not only the past and the artifacts of the past, but how we make something of those artifacts.
Mm.
On the one hand, I think you can think about that quote as reminding us that we see the traces of the past through our own lens. Here we sit in 2025, right? And that perhaps we should not expect ourselves to literally transport to the past as much as we try and do that we're always asking questions and reading the evidence through our 21st century perspective. I think that's so important as a kind of caution. Aren't we always writing for our own moment anyway, right?
Ooh.
That we are writing for ourselves, we are writing for one another. I think this idea would endorse the view that the way we work and how we work must exercise a profound ethics of care for ancestors. At the same time, we are writing very much for our own time and for the questions that we have. That means for someone like me, the answers that an ancestor might give for what a moment meant might not be my answer because I'm answering it sitting in another time and in another place.
Yes, indeed. With that said, I really found your writing deeply intimate and resonant. Not only the recounting of your familial history through the lens of the color line, but I appreciate your memoir's attention to the shifting contours of this color line due to the state and other factors, and how this shaped not only your family's legacy, but also the legacy of this nation. And I love that you uplifted this phrase, ethics of care. That's something that's absolutely present in your memoir. The labor that you took to not only stage this project, but also moments where you build almost like a inner emotional affective space for your ancestors, just reading from artifacts, documents, records, and conversations. Right now I'm thinking about the vulnerability and disarming sincerity that you lead with in the book, recounting this question that stayed with you for decades. Can you briefly recount this particular moment where you were asked, who do you think you are?
So I'm going to take us back to 1976. And I am a freshman in college. I am fresh out of the suburbs of Long Island, and I've come to upstate New York. Without a second thought, I know that I'm going to be a psychology major and a Black Studies minor. Black Studies is a brand new field in this moment. Young, brilliant minds unleashed on sociology and history, on literature, psychology, and more. And there are the classes, right? You can step into the room and read the greats. And I'm not thinking too much about how I might be perceived in the class. I'm mostly anxious about trying to be I had not been a very good student in high school. So I'm trying to be a better student. And our professor has us do oral reports. And I volunteer to read and report on Frantz Fanon's Dying Colonialism. I laugh when I say that because I really had no clue. But that's why you're there, right? I mean, you're there to learn. So, no disrespect to my 18-year-old self. And I read the book. I take out my index cards. I write out my notes, and I am shaking a bit. But when it's my day, I get up in front of the room and I begin. And I don't get very far in when a member of the class stands up, Ron. Ron, who was by then, an important leader coming out of the Black Student Union on our campus. And Ron is irate. He really doesn't think that the likes of me should be standing in front of the room and holding forth on, of all things, Frantz Fanon. And he he interrupts the room. He challenges me. He speaks to the professor. And, I stand my ground. At least I stay in front of the room, and he finishes and I finish, and then, get out of Dodge and go
Yeah.
back to my dorm room. But I tell that story because it's a pivotal one for me. Ron and I become friends and comrades in student government and the student newspaper. So it's a longer story between Ron and me. But he taught me something, which was that when I showed up in a space like a Black Studies classroom, I could expect that folks were going to have questions about who I was, what I was, whether I belonged, and who on earth I thought I was, right? To claim space, and a tiny bit of authority, the authority that is a presentation as a freshman in college, but that authority even, right, when it comes to Black studies. And I needed to know that. I needed to be equipped with that awareness as I continued to move in the world. And so I have a kind of gratitude to him, and I've never forgotten that
Wow.
moment.
Wow. Thank you so much for that powerful recounting, Martha. There's such a rich number of ancestors that you explore in your memoir, and you're wearing a shirt that alludes to quite a number of them. Um, so I'm thinking about Nancy Bell Graves, David Dallas Jones, Elijah Mary Jones, Fannie Miller Williams, among others. Also thinking about this wonderful, wonderful text that you referenced, the Negro Vanguard. But with that said, I'm wondering, Martha, if you could share with us just a little bit about your own family's legacy through any ancestors you'd like to highlight. And in particular, were there any details that kind of startled you, surprised you? You mentioned earlier there were things that you found resonant in your own experience while you were staging this research. Yeah, anything you'd like to uplift here?
Sure. First of all, thank you for naming them. It's really still very strong for me to hear their names, come through my ears from folks who are meeting them for the first time. So I thank you for that very much. Part of the process of writing The Trouble of Color was sifting through the stories that I had inherited. Some of them are the stories that, we hear around the Thanksgiving table and on and on. In my family, there were like 6 of those, right? We just tell them over and over again. I think that's true in a lot of families. But you referenced the Richard Bardolph's book, The Negro Vanguard. And that was really an important text for me because my grandfather's older brother, my great uncle, who in the book I call the bishop, because he was a bishop, the bishop was interviewed by Bardolph, and Bardolph recounted much of his family history, our family history in that book. And for a long time, I treated that pretty much like gospel. Right? I didn't question it. I was kind of awed by it. And I ordered my thinking about the family through it. And one of the things that the bishop had said about his line of the family is that they had never been enslaved, or they had never been slaves, is how he would have put it. And okay, I took that at face value, I guess, until a distant cousin in California, who shared my passion for genealogy, sent me a document. It was a document from the Freedmen's Bureau, which was the federal agency that took over for the Army and organized the South after the Civil War. And it was a complaint dictated by our great-great-grandmother, Isabella Holly. And Isabella Holly had come before federal officials to complain about the man who was the father of her children. he had abandoned her and them, and he had, before the war, been the man who claimed them as property. They had been his so-called slaves. So what to do, right, when you're writing a family memoir and you've got this rich narrative constructed by an elder who's now an ancestor, someone you have extraordinarily high regard for, only to discover that he hadn't told the whole story. And this is, partly an ethical question. It's partly just an emotional, affective question. But I came to think about writing the book as a conversation with him, right? Which is to say, I wasn't there to argue with him. I wasn't there to correct him, set the record straight, as some folks might say. That I really was there with an opportunity to talk to him, to understand as best I could why he told the story the way he did, and to tell him something about what it's like to retell that story in 2025. A time when I would say perhaps we no longer are burdened by things like shame or the judgments that we think might come to us because we come from and are from families that included many enslaved people. Instead, I would say in 2025, we take that as a point of pride, right? And we hold them up, right? And we venerate them openly. And maybe in his time, he couldn't imagine that. And in his life, he couldn't see it that way. But I wanted to tell him, it actually gets better. It changes for us because we no longer are burdened by the things that kept him silent about some of the past.
Oh, thank you so much, Martha, for that response. Absolutely. We're going to touch upon just how do we navigate these notions of shame while thinking through our family legacies. So thank you so much for touching upon that. But I'm also curious, were there any key moments in your family story that shed light on larger patterns in American history?
Absolutely. I am the child of two Americans who were married in 1957. It was still true in 1957 that something like 18 states in the U.S. Still prohibited marriage across the so-called color line. And my mother was a so-called white woman from working class Buffalo, New York, child of German and Irish immigrants. And my father was a Black American, so-called, from North Carolina, the descendant of slaves and free people of color. And they couldn't marry in North Carolina. They did marry in New York. They had me a year later. And I was raised in a time when there was a lot of talk about families like ours and people like my parents. Much of it was unflattering and unkind. But more to your point, I was also raised to think that they were the first in our family to cross the color line in that way. And it was really only when I did a deep dive into this book and I revisited, for example, my great-grandparents, Mary and Elijah Jones in Little, Texas, which is central North Carolina, the Piedmont. And I discovered that Mary had started her life as a white woman. She married Elijah. She became, now I want you to tell folks I'm using quotes, right? But she became, right, a woman of color in order to marry Elijah, in order to make a family, to insulate that family from the laws that outlawed their marriage, that would have torn their family apart. And so um, she's a fascinating character to me because she lives a rather harrowing existence, always at risk for being exposed. But what she taught me was that the story I knew about my own parents was not simply a civil rights era story. It's a long story in America about people who, you know, live and love and make families and build communities in defiance of the color line, and not only in deference to it. But nobody had ever put it that way. Um, I had to, in a way, discover that for myself.
Yes, indeed. I'm just struck on just the courage, we can call it that, um, to renounce whiteness in a time like this. Um, my goodness. And often when we talk about the color line in passing, it's often, we think about black folks who pass as white, but never the reverse. So thank you so much for lifting that
Well,
up.
can I say
Yeah,
one more thing about that?
please.
Because I have to invoke, not because I think it's analogous, but because I think that it may come to mind for other folks. The infamous example
Oh,
of Rachel Dolezal.
yeah.
And so, honestly, when I began to first think about and write about Mary, I worried, right, that our 21st century, uh, you know, views and condemnation even of Rachel Dolezal, her kind of theft of blackness, right, might be the way that readers would interpret Mary. And that might be the way some readers interpret Mary. I have to allow for that. An author doesn't get to tell you how to read or how you think about it. And I wouldn't want to. Um, but I hoped I gave folks enough about her to think deeply about what it meant for her to, quote unquote, become a woman of color before they decide um, how they might judge that.
Mhm. My goodness. Thank you so much for lifting that up. I hadn't even considered Rachel Dolezal. Um,
Well,
in
that's good. That's good. That's good news for me, right? Which is to say, because I think Rachel Dolezal has probably gotten more ink than she deserves in many ways,
yeah.
if I could put it that way. But because um, looking at a woman in the 1820s and the choices that she's making, I think is hardly analogous to the choices that someone might make in the 21st century.
Absolutely, absolutely. Intention absolutely needs to be considered here in thinking through these figures. But that does make me curious, specifically around the visibility or rising visibility of interracial or interracial couples or mixed race families in our cultural sphere. Some may feel like this signals a great deal of progress, and in some ways, I can absolutely see that. But with that said, I'm curious, Martha, do you feel the color line still troubles notions of Black family legacies today, if at all? And do you feel the rising visibility of mixed race families signals a bit of progress?
Mm, there's a lot in those questions. So you'll remind me if I leave part of it out, but let me try. Um, I'm somebody who was raised without regret or rethinking. I was raised by way of the one drop rule,
Mm,
and, which is to say, I was raised in a world that was black and white and some other things, but never in between, right? We got to check one box.
mm,
And in part because I was raised in a family um, in which my mother's white relations pretty much disowned her for a time.
mm,
Um, I was also raised in a black family, and so I, I never had, profound questions about who I was. But it is also true, right, that um, going back to that moment with Ron, part of what Ron didn't know to ask me, but I understood was underneath his question is that, yeah, I had a white mother, and maybe we didn't really know what that meant. Maybe we didn't know what that was supposed to mean in 1976. I certainly didn't have a word for it. Like I didn't think I was mulatto. Like that was no longer like in common parlance. We didn't have terms like mixed race or biracial and the kinds of things that my students, use to refer to themselves. So, in a way, I am an artifact, right, of the past and of my own time. And because I teach young people, they have helped me to practice a kind of forbearance, which is to say, they may come in from families that seem to look like mine, but they are born in a different era and in another kind of context. And where I might say I'm Black, they may say they are biracial or they are mixed race. When they're cheeky, they're mulatto. That's okay too. And so I think that kind of forbearance as an educator, right, is essential, because I am not there to persuade my students they should see themselves quite like me, even if they do see some aspect of themselves. Now, you asked me about families, and I think one of the things about American families today is that, in some sense, while I am interested and even a little preoccupied by, so-called interracial families, and interracial families still make news, sometimes good, sometimes not good, sometimes favorable, sometimes not. I think there's another story that one is embedded in, which is that American families today are mixed, blended, complicated, all mixed up. And you don't have to be Black, you don't have to be white to claim a kind of, complicated story about who you are and where you come from. My father married a second time. He married a Jewish American woman. And we found ourselves now participating in holiday and family rituals that were not of our faith, but were of her culture. What is that? I don't think I would tell you I'm a Jewish American, but I would tell you I know a little bit about some of the rituals and traditions and beliefs that are associated with Judaism. And I think there's so many families today where we are, we have just watched a very prominent example in the family of Kamala Harris, right? Harris tells us, right? Her West Indian father, her South Asian mother, her Jewish American husband, and they do holidays all kinds of ways. They think about culture and tradition in all kinds of ways. And I don't mean that's easy or I don't mean it to be blithe. I just mean it as an observation about families in our country today. And so I think many of us know what it means to be of more than one tradition.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. And we absolutely are going to touch upon just how might we redefine family to account for more fluid notions, more capacious notions, like even chosen family. Thank you so much for speaking to that, Martha. But I got a bit of a stickler question on the flip side here.
Good.
There is I can't call it a rising sentiment because I do imagine this has been around for a while, but it does land with me as a bit almost insidious. So in some Black radical spaces, there are some folks who will dismiss the work of Black scholars who've partnered with white persons. So thinking about folks like Amir Raka, to Baldwin, even Frantz Fanon. And maybe this is a response to rising Afro-pessimism or something like that. But I'm curious, Martha, from your perspective, how do you respond to folks who claim that having a white partner delegitimizes the scholarship of Black radical thinkers?
Well, that's a good question for me. And I think an important one to surface. I am a Black scholar. I have a white partner, as some folks will know. Um, and I think the first thing I'd want to put in front of us is something that I think I learned from and have sat with from our queer brothers and sisters, right? It has something like love is love. Love
Mm-hmm.
is love. And I subscribe to that view as a matter of politics, but I think also as a matter of personal worldview is one. I like your list, and I might pull it back and
Mm-hmm.
say Frederick Douglass.
Yeah.
We could do a list of Black thinkers, activists, creatives, folks who have profoundly, shaped and defined our culture and our politics and more. And I can't subscribe to a view that would bracket those folks out. Yeah. And let me say this.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the thing I really want to say, which is, I don't think Blackness is a card, right? I don't think folks get to, snatch my card, revoke my card, because it ain't no cards. There,
Yes.
there are no cards. And in my view, and that means that the challenge, right, is to, I think, to honor and to hold on to and to wrap our arms around Blackness in all of its baffling complexity, and to believe that there is something, as I do, coherent in that. Coherent in that. Now, I am someone who is not a stranger to efforts to undermine or to shame or to marginalize folks who either come from, there's probably a whole TikTok series about those of us who have white mothers, and we're not really Black because we have white mothers. We're not really Black because we have white partners. And as I said, that's not how it works. And at least for myself, I will say, I'm not giving up my seat at the table. I'm going to show up. And I urge you, not in some Pollyanna way, but in some true way, judge me by who I am. Judge me by the work I do. Judge me by how I show up in the world. And I hope that tells you something else about who I am, because I cannot be reduced to my mother, though my mother, I cherish my mother. She was beyond, cherished in my life. I have a husband who is, an angel, and so I would never deny them. But I also would say you just can't reduce me to that either. And I don't know wholly why you'd want to.
Yes. Yes, indeed. Thank you so much for that rich response, Martha. Just to put a cap on it for me,
Mm,
I've often been just deeply alarmed by that line of kind of questioning, interrogation, and just almost like the wholesale dismissal of such rich contributions to Black studies, to Black culture. It's wild that it often comes from folks who identify as Black radicals, because I don't know why they would want to subscribe to kind of colonial confines of race and kind of
mm,
in
mm,
that.
mm,
So thank you so much for breaking that open for us. Appreciate you, Martha. Um, I do want to think through the relationship between the state, the government, and
mm,
family making. because that's something that really kind of lives throughout your text, but also throughout our histories when thinking about Black families. I'm curious, Martha, what does it mean to make or unmake a family through systems of power like the law or state archives? And do you feel that these archives, these systems, do you feel like they work against Black families? Yeah, any thoughts there?
Yeah. The part of the state, which is, sort of a huge construct, right? The part of the state that most concerns me in this book, but more broadly, the part I'm most interested in is the quotidian, right?
Mm,
The everyday kinds of encounters with the state that look to tell us who we are and who we are to one another, right? So here, I have immersed myself in marriage licenses and birth and death certificates, census returns,
mm,
pension applications, all of these kind of, bureaucratic, ministerial scenes in
mm,
which we are called upon to tell our stories, and officials try and fit us into boxes and onto forms. And these are we might forget them because of course we are rightly also concerned with what happens in a Supreme Court or in Congress or these other sort of high manifestations of the state. But I think for many of us, uh, nearly all our confrontations with the state happen in those small ways. Right? They happen in those small ways. And so for me, I began to read those kinds of artifacts as storytelling,
mm,
not to take them as fact, right? But to take them as a version of a story. My great, great, great grandmother, Nancy, born enslaved in Danville, Kentucky in 1808, lives until the 1880s, marries her longtime partner, a Civil War veteran after emancipation. And as an older woman, she applies for his Civil War pension. And she has to fill out a form that asks her questions about her family.
mm,
And I know almost right away when I finally receive a copy of that application, which has been preserved by the National Archives, also the state, by the way, um, I see that she has reported the names and ages of some of her children, and she's left others out.
mhm,
Now, I don't think that Nancy is renouncing the children who are in the form. So the puzzle now I'm left with is to understand better why she told this story to pension officials and another story to the census taker and yet another story to her daughter and her granddaughter. Right? And that is, for me, a way to demonstrate how it is that we negotiate with, we wrestle with, and
mm,
we even defy the state. In Nancy's time, um, and this is the work of historian Brandy Brimmer, we know that Black women who apply for Civil War pensions are subjected to a hyper scrutiny. Not
mm,
only do they need to prove the basic facts, they are suspected of being dishonest, unchaste, and more.
mm,
I think Nancy tells a story about her beloved Edmund and the children she bore with him. They show up on the pension form, but the children that she bore as an enslaved woman before Edmund, she doesn't report, because I think this would fuel what Dr. Brimmer explains, right, is that kind of hyper scrutiny. So I think that breaking down the state, seeing it in its everyday manifestations, sometimes lets us see that even when the state has designs on us, we are frequently not only understand the logics of the state, but we are maneuvering through them and around them and sometimes beyond them. Now, it's important to say Nancy never gets her pension. I don't think it's because of the story she told about her family, but she doesn't get it nonetheless. So I don't mean to end with a kind of triumphalist note.
Yeah.
But still, I think that my understanding of her shifted when I understood how she very strategically approached that process and that effort to get what she had coming to her as Edmund's widow.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. My goodness. Well, I want to think about redefining family legacies as we try to move and navigate beyond the state. Um, and you alluded to something earlier in our conversation where you mentioned the way in which you initially sort of kind of framed or conceptualized the notion of familial legacy was through like material inheritances. Um, I'm curious, Martha. It seems like we, Black folks, diaspora, especially on these shores, I feel, we often celebrate Black families who risen to material success. So musical dynasties like the Jacksons or business empires like the Johnson Publishing Company, mega superstars like the Carters, so on and so forth. I'm curious, Martha, am I being too harsh if I feel that this particular notion of familial dynasty or legacy is influenced by histories of imperialism or colonialism? Is that unfair to say?
I think that there is a dimension of that that I would name also is the history of capitalism, right? And a belief that capitalism will, as we say, that capitalism will set us free, right? And so what do we do with in my view, right, the layers of misunderstanding that equation is built upon? I think it's fair to say. In my family story, well, there are no capitalists, at best I know, of any consequence, right? But there are folks who are trying to build their own kinds of material legacies. And here I want to mention my grandfather, who I heard you mention at the start, David Dallas Jones. And David Jones is born to a mother who was one time a slave, raised under the most humble of circumstances in a Black enclave in Greensboro, North Carolina, has the extraordinary fortune of an education and the start of a career. But in 1926, he's still a relatively young man, and he's called back to Greensboro because there's a school there called Bennett Seminary, and Bennett is about to be remade into a college for women, Bennett College, and they call him back to become president of Bennett. And for the remainder of his natural life, my grandfather is devoted to the building of the college, the brick and the mortar, the lawns, the walks, all the things, and also devoted to the extraordinary minds of the young women who live and learn and begin to make their way on his campus. Is that a legacy? Sure. Is even a material legacy of sorts. And my grandfather dealt with a lot of capitalists, let me tell you, because you don't build an HBCU in the early 20th century unless you've got a grant from the state or you are allying yourself with like-minded capitalist philanthropists, which he did with great success in building Bennett. I think, as I often do, maybe you're hearing it, I want to complicate the stark binaries, right, that we often use when we put on our kind of pseudo-sociological hats and we want to tell you how the world is organized and remind us, right, that, my grandfather was no Sheila Johnson. And by the way, I was recently to one of Sheila Johnson's resorts, and let me tell you, right about now, if you want to splurge and you don't want to be visited by problematic folks,
Okay.
Sheila Johnson, runs Black resorts where, I don't know. I just want to say I had a very interesting time, and there were a lot of folks there, I think, like me, looking for 2 days in a haven. So that's an aside. My grandfather was no Sheila Johnson, right? But he did business with people, white folks, not unlike Sheila Johnson, right? Who had money to spend and money to give away so that he could build dormitories and classrooms and a chapel and more at Bennett. So where does that place him on the, on the scale of, complicitness, with, the pernicious systems of colonialism, of racism, of empire, of capitalism on the one hand, and on, the other hand, that affirmation that is the building of Black institutions for Black folks, by Black folks. Both things are, I think, vividly true in his story. And he knew that. And he understood the world he was navigating. He was not naive. Did he make the right choices? Did he make the right compromises? Did he do business with the right people? That's for other folks to judge. But I offer it up just to complicate that binary.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much, Martha. Want to hold on to this line of complicating these binaries, but also some of the complications that arise in our own family histories. We touched upon this notion of shame, uncovering certain details. Some folks may rather leave uncovered when recounting their familial histories. And right now, I'm really thinking about just the legacies of violence that may exist in our family histories. Many of us have our own hidden histories, be it with sexual violence or disavowed relatives. What I'm curious to know, Martha, is what practical steps can families take to kind of acknowledge these painful truths and maybe even turn them into a source of healing? How might we begin to kind of reckon with just shame and violence in family histories where we can still account for it and maybe turn it to something more generative moving forward?
I love that question. Because for me, this book was in many ways an instrument of healing. And it opens with the words, the lyrics of a spiritual. Yes. Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water. God's going to trouble the water. This is one of my grandmother's favorites. And it took me some time before I understood what was meant by trouble in this particular spiritual. Now, trouble, of course, has its evident meaning, the difficulties. But in this, the spiritual comes from a biblical verse that tells us, right, God troubles the water and then beckons us to step in. And that it is when we step into those troubled waters that we are healed, that we are made whole. And I think this for me is the answer to your question, right? That we fear the trouble, the roiling water. We're not sure if we can swim. We're not sure. We step in with our toes, maybe our knees, all the trepidation. But the message of wade in the water is when you step in, when you wholly step in, you will be remade, you will be healed, you will be well. But you have to step in to that water.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Oh my gosh. I didn't know we was gonna get this spiritual, Martha.
Well, thank you for making space for that. But I'll say that, I really did, first learn that spiritual from my own grandmother. But it was a long time before I went back to the Bible verse and understood better that she believed, right? And she was imparting to us this view that said, no more shame, no more hiding, no more covering up, right? Not because that's easy or self-evident. That will be difficult, but we will be remade, transformed, healed even by that. And so when we think about folks who are contemplating or, engaged in family history, and there's so many of us, I can only offer my own example and say, I think that writing this book really changed me, and not only my sense of myself, but my sense of who I am in the world. It means maybe like I never could have before. I can come on to a podcast like this one with someone as thoughtful, but also someone as probing as you are, and not feel afraid. If you had asked me, 3 years ago, would we be having this conversation? Would I be letting you ask me these kind? Now, I'm somebody who has a day job, and I speak to a lot of folks about a lot of things, most of them law and history related, but this is different. And after writing this book, I feel better. And after many, many years of people asking me hard questions about myself, kind and sometimes unkind, I'm a different person today because I waded into the water.
Mic drop. Okay. Oh my God. Thank you, Martha. We can absolutely spend all day with you. I got mad more questions, but I really want to get to just two of these. My goodness. For folks who are listening, who are invested and interested in creating their own family archive, tracing their family's roots, but also may be intimidated by engaging in official state archives and whatnot, may not know where to begin. What practical tips do you have for folks to just get the process started?
I think we can't underestimate, becoming parts of communities, whether they're in our local public library or they're online communities, connecting with other folks. I'm part of Facebook groups, with folks who are researching family history, because I think we get reassurance, validation, and sometimes some very good tips from folks who are doing the same work. So remembering that we're part of a collective in the work, and we're not here alone. And so, find that community, plug in, even if you lurk for a while before you post or you weigh in, because I think that will bring you a kind of company and a kind of reassurance. It definitely, definitely has for me. When going to places, and I did visit places that were intimidating and where I wasn't sure I would be welcome, I would say phone a friend. I have dragged my sister to New Orleans. She thought she was going to, I don't know, eat beignets and eat Dookie Chase, and I made her sit in the archives. But it helped me to have her company, both just in the introducing myself and getting those materials and beginning to look, but also in processing them in very private ways. And we have, I think, important memories of that time together. So we don't have to go alone to these places. But I think also remember, and this is the last thing I'll say, that many, particularly state archives today, their lifeblood is genealogy. They are thrilled to see genealogists because folks in the state capitol are not as enthusiastic as they might have been once upon a time about financing archives. I live in the state of Maryland, and some years ago, the legislature basically proposed to shut down the archives to the public. And it was the genealogists who rose up and organized and showed lawmakers that there was an important calling for the state archives, and not only for official work, but for the work of family history. So know that frequently your archivist knows that you are precisely the kind of person they want to see come through the door, because you are the reason they are still there, that they have an allocation, that they have staff, that they have lights and heat, and more. So you are a partner with those archivists, even if they're a little prickly, even if they're a little standoffish, even if they're a little particular about how you handle the materials. They know who you are and how important you are to what they do.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Thank you for those rich, practical tips to help folks get started. As I mentioned, Martha, it's been a pleasure being in conversation with you. I'm lamenting that we're on our last question now, but we absolutely got to have you back whenever you have space. But to get us on out of here, we want to engage in a bit of speculation, Martha. So here at PushBlack, we've conceptualized this notion of Liberation Island. Black Liberation Island, everybody's invited. And you, Martha, are tasked with bringing just one book, one film, and one album to contribute to the Black Liberation Library on Black Liberation Island. With that said, what would you bring and why?
This is easy. And I'm a reader, but I have one book in mind, and that's the late and the great Derek Bell's Faces at the Bottom of the Well. Bell was a legal scholar, a really cutting edge legal scholar when it came to work on race and racism. One of the founders of the much misunderstood and often maligned, but very, very worthy movement we call critical race theory. But Bell knew that hard-edged legal analysis was never going to be enough for us. And he began to write fantasy and speculative fiction and parable and more to free our minds. That really was part of his project, to release us from the shackles that the histories we learned in school, the literature that was fed to us, the legal logics that had come to inhabit our consciousness, Bell wanted to free us of that. And so his stories are fantastical, but they are a gift for those of us who are looking to occupy your liberation island. Bell is one part historian, and that's important to me. He doesn't want us to lose sight of the past or to let go or to imagine that the past isn't something that is also part of us, but he wants to teach us how to think past and through and beyond the past in ways that are difficult, in the ways that are challenging. I think Bell would say, be careful, inhabitants of Liberation Island. You too will be tempted to create difference and hierarchy and more. And so let's develop a practice that reminds us again and again that the dangers of man-made differences and the way we mobilize them, that even Liberation Island might be susceptible to that if we're not vigilant.
My God. Thank you so much, Martha, for sharing all your brilliance, all your warmth, your time, your expertise. We deeply appreciate you taking time out to speak with us, and we can't wait to have you back on. Thank you, Martha.
Well, if I could just thank you. I said to you before we came on the recording, these are such important conversations for me and for so many of us that you all make possible. But we can only have them if we're in good hands. And so I very much appreciate your, the thoughtfulness, the care for you and the whole team at PushBlack, because I've had a chance to talk with other folks sort of off the air, and so it's been an honor for me, and again I thank you very much.
You are very welcome, Martha. Thank you.